So for our final presentation or event in this part of this morning, we've got an interview and one of our lay representatives on the CPSSQ management group, Jill Lloyd, is going to be interviewing Josephine about her experiences. So just explain a little bit about both Josephine and Jill's backgrounds. So first of all, as I say, Jill is involved with one of our two lay members who's involved with us at a strategic level within the CPSSQ. She's also involved as a lay representative in a number of research and service development projects that we're doing. And she has agreed to interview for us Josephine Ocloo. And Dr Josephine Ocloo is the project lead for the Imperial College Health Partners Patient Safety Champion Network. So I'll hand over to the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryony. So, Josephine, welcome. Could you tell us the story about how all this started?
So, it's great to be given an opportunity to tell that story. It's a difficult story, and it's not the type of story that often gets told in the patient safety context because it's not a nice one. I was born in North West London. I've used services in North West London all my life, and my children were born in North West London. And so this is where my story starts. My daughter Krista was born one of twins, and she was born with a heart condition called Fallot's tetralogy. It's a congenital heart condition, and it required her to have major heart surgery. And she had this surgery shortly before her second birthday. She had the surgery under a leading cardiac North West London hospital. I was told that it was a successful correction. I wasn't ever led to believe that, further on in her life, other problems might occur. She basically had a very happy childhood with her twin sister who didn't have any medical problems. And I just want to stick up the first picture. Krista is on the far right there, and basically that's the way the girls were when they were 8 months old. And then with the next picture, I'm just kind of reinforcing the fact this was after Krista had her heart surgery when she went on to lead a normal kind of happy childhood. And so the problems occurred shortly before her 16th birthday. She started to complain of shortness of breath and chest pain. We'd never had any problems before. Krista had been monitored under the hospital all of her life, and we'd been under one consultant. We had a good relationship, as far as I understood, with that consultant. There was never any cause for concern. We went back and obviously we shared the fact that she was having these symptoms. I think that was probably the first time when I kind of felt I wasn't getting information, but that was back in the day when I was a parent. I knew absolutely nothing about medicine or patient safety. I had a social work background, never been involved in healthcare in any sense before, and I didn't want to upset anybody, and I just thought, okay, he wants her to have an exploratory catheterisation, let's do that and see what comes back. So Krista came in overnight, she had the catheterisation, and we were reassured that everything was absolutely fine. She was fine, nothing to worry about. We actually went off and celebrated. We were just so relieved and happy. And then it was really, that was in the January, and it was really later on that year, on what was just a normal day for me. I was a lecturer in social work in what I now describe as my old life. I came home, my girls were teenagers. Krista said she didn't feel very well, so she went upstairs to bed and I took her up a water bottle. And then a little bit later on that evening, my daughter Kelly started shouting. And I thought the girls were arguing, so I started to go up the stairs to say, girls, what's the matter? And Kelly just stood at the top of the stairs and she said, something's wrong with Krista. And I knew it was something dreadful. I could tell by her face. I just ran up the stairs, ran straight into the bedroom. Krista was lying Krista was lying. I found her dead in bed. And I didn't know what had happened at all. I didn't realise that it was something to do with her heart. I was only to find out much later that she had chronic heart failure and had died because of that. And what I didn't realise was that the hell was really just beginning in terms of trying to get answers.
So there was no indication beforehand that there were any problems?
Well, you know, we'd gone in for the catheterisation. Yes. As I said, she'd had a normal life, and we'd been reassured with the catheterisation that everything was absolutely fine. So when Krista died in the way that she did, suddenly and unexpectedly, I still didn't believe it on the night. I mean, my life collapsed and ended there. I didn't believe on the night that she had died, and I didn't even know what it was. I thought it was something to do with the flu, in actual fact, because I hadn't been told there were any issues, and I found out about the issues subsequently through what has been a very, very long fight to get answers.
So what were the reactions of the medical professionals?
So, I mean, there were a series of different reactions from different people within the healthcare system. So, I mean, Krista had been under this hospital all of her life, and so of course what did? I contacted the hospital. I obviously was desperate to speak to someone about what had happened and to tell them what had happened. That was the first shock. Nobody bothered to return my call. So in those early days of shock and over that weekend, I never got a call back. It was almost as if, having spent our whole lives under that hospital, it was like we just didn't count for anything. I then went to my GP because my daughter had died and I had no information. Actually, Krista had a number of problems with her heart. There were serious problems, and that she should have had a follow-up appointment within 6 months of the catheterisation that I hadn't been told about. I then wrote to the coroner's court because I was desperate to find out what had happened and get the issues looked at. So I wrote seeking an inquest, and if I could put the next slide up. And so you'll see there in the second paragraph that he wrote back to me in quotes, "Quite frankly, what information you were given and whether your daughter's death could have been prevented or postponed is not a minefield I'm inclined to enter." He said that Krista had died of natural causes. So within 3 weeks, I was pushed into the complaint system. I had no choice but to go into the complaint system. One of the agonies for me has been some of what I feel has been the kind of almost blaming or pathologising of people like me as almost like, you know, you're the problem, you blame doctors, you go into the complaint system. Well, I had no choice but to go into the complaint system. I'd lost my beautiful, precious daughter. The first stage was local resolution. I got no answers. They basically said that there wasn't a problem. The second stage was the independent review panel, and the independent review panels have now been, they were abolished, and they've now been reintroduced again under post-Francis, and I'm really not sure if they're going to do a better job than they did last time. Both of those stages said there were no problems. So I then didn't know what to do. This was now more than 2 years after my daughter died. And then one day I was sitting in my room. I'd actually become quite depressed, and I heard on the radio that there was a whistleblower, and they said that the baby deaths were too high under this hospital. Now again, that's another thing that I feel I've been blamed for, that you run to the press. Well, in 2.5 years, I had never gone to the press. I'd never told my story to the press. But when I heard this, I immediately went to the press and I told my story, and nearly 50 other families contacted me saying that there were issues. And so we formed a group. And I think one of the painful things, and I've never actually forgotten this, was the people who made up the families in that group. Many of those families were working class families, white working class families, and there was a separate group made up of families whose children had Down syndrome. But I always remember with the working class families, I heard story after story. They rang me, and they were people that had had bad experiences, who never thought that they could challenge the hospital, and I immediately became the chair of that group. We eventually got an inquiry which produced a report. This was in 2001. It made 120 recommendations for change. It had no remit to look at negligence, but they wrote to me specifically to tell me anyway that there was no negligence in Krista's care. And so I went into court. I was dissatisfied with the independence of those inquiries. I went into court. I was only entitled to £7,500. Again, that's another myth that people do this for the money. I've spent I've spent 4 times that amount trying to get answers. I couldn't afford the insurance. 40,000 to go into court to cover myself, and so I just went in unprotected. I got the judgment back in December 2001. It marked the 5th anniversary of Krista's death. If I could put the next slide up. So basically the judgment, it marked the 5th anniversary of Krista's death. The judge accepted that Krista should have been followed up and kept under active review. Her GP and I told that her ventricular tachycardia, symptomatic arrhythmia, was a cause of clinical concern. She needed to be told to avoid severe physical exertion and to reattend the hospital if symptoms persisted or other symptoms appeared.
So how did you feel through all this?
Well, just following on a little bit from that, and the hospital was found negligent for failing to organise suitable further appointments for Krista. I still lost my case on causation, so I got a ruling of negligence, but you have to prove that that negligence was directly causative of the death. I lost on causation. Hospital argued and won. Despite their negligence, they said Krista would have died anyway. And so basically, I was awarded, costs were awarded against me of £120,000. Which would have made me bankrupt if I hadn't gone to the press. And it was the press that told my story. And if I could just flick, so this was one of the articles in The Guardian. The next one was in the Sunday Telegraph. And again, this was my local Kilburn Times where I live. And it was again in December 2006 that new evidence emerged. First of all, I was contacted by another mother of a 17-year-old who died under the same consultant. I also discovered that there were about many other families that had gone to this Evans inquiry that were actually complaining about one doctor. And so I now had a whole cluster of cases, similar cases, that were raising similar issues. And I'd also discovered that a doctor employed under the hospital that I hadn't known about was saying that she felt there was negligence. Now, I didn't find out about that doctor's evidence until after 3 inquiries. All of the inquiries had been completed, and her evidence was not put to those inquiries. I did know about her at the court case. I didn't call her because she didn't want to testify in court against her employers. I then next slide, please. I then decided to go to the GMC, and the GMC refused to look at the case. They said it was outside of 5 years, it was not in the public interest. And I think it was in 2007 when I became a patient safety champion, WHO Patients for Patient Safety Champion, and I was in Dublin and I was listening to Sir Liam Donaldson speak. And it was pretty terrifying actually, because I kind of just wanted to say something, and mine was the type of story that you didn't talk about, because people had sent me messages for many, many years. No blame culture. You can't talk about accountability. You can't say those things. But I did stand up and I did ask Salim a question, and he did ask me to come in and see him, and he did intervene on my behalf, and he wrote to the GMC, I feel the allegations are very serious, and thus you may wish to consider them despite the lapse of time since they originally occurred. The GMC still refused to carry out an investigation. Next slide, please. I then, after talking at a conference about my story, The Guardian ran my story. And as a result of that, I then returned to the Department of Health, and the Department of Health started to review some of the evidence. Next slide, please. And they picked up 2 major bits of evidence that needed to have an independent investigation. And you'll see here with this first slide, what was written as part of a review of the evidence is that they wrote, as far as I can ascertain, her views, and this is the consultant employed by the hospital, were not made known either to the independent review or the Evans inquiry. It's now evident that this was in clear contradiction of the hospital's standing procedures for the conduct of those inquiries. And then with the next slide, again, it highlighted the fact that there were all of these issues about the cases that needed to be looked at. The Department of Health subsequently did not do an independent investigation. They met with the hospital and they said that, you know, there wasn't any need for another independent investigation. And so finally, I went to the Ombudsman and I approached the Ombudsman saying, look, I've got all these cases, more than 22 cases. I know that evidence was withheld by a doctor who's got concerns about negligence in my daughter's case, and it was withheld from the inquiries. And Robert Francis responded by saying, wrote to him and he said, if the material you refer to was available at the time and should have been given to the various inquiries but was not, then it could raise a question mark over the validity of those processes. I would respectfully suggest that is a concern which you may wish to raise with the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman refused to look at the case and said that I was out of time. I was 3 months over the 1-year time limit. Again, they had the discretion to set that aside. And so that was the reaction of the medical profession and other regulatory bodies to my attempt to get some closure, to get some answers and to get some closure with respect to my daughter's death.
So this all went on some considerable time. How did you feel throughout this time?
Well, it's been heartbreaking.
Yes.
It's been absolutely heartbreaking because, first of all, there's been the loss of my daughter. And you cannot come to terms with that sort of loss, particularly when a child, a much-loved child, dies suddenly and unexpectedly. You know, there are no goodbyes. And then you find yourself labelled and pathologised, and that has been one of the most traumatic things. I have now been in patient safety for quite a long time. I've got a PhD in patient safety. For many, many, many years, I've been the lone voice in patient safety, walking around. I would find myself, I would put my hand up. My attempt was to ask a question about patient and public involvement or about accountability. I would challenge anyone who knows me to say whether I have ever done anything inappropriate in these environments. I've never lost my temper or anything like that. I've asked legitimate questions, but actually, often people haven't taken my questions. They haven't wanted me to speak. And it's just truly been a gut-wrenching, lonely experience. I have felt as if I have this label on my head saying, you are the bad experience.
So what made you channel all your pain and frustration in this direction?
Well, there wasn't ever a game plan. There's no game plan because when something horrible like this happens, you don't kind of make active choices. I didn't make any active choices, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not really sure that I wanted to be in patient safety. You know, first and foremost, what I wanted was to find answers. So I wanted an independent investigation, which I still have not been able to achieve, despite all of this long campaign. I wanted to make sure that I could honour my daughter's memory. I wanted to make sure that my daughter wasn't simply tossed aside as a statistic, as if she didn't count for anything. But subsequently, I did want to make sure that things changed, so these sorts of things never happened again. So there wasn't a game plan, and I have found that, you know, I had to leave my career and really just try and go with the flow. And, you know, what has been important to me, I guess what has driven me is the memory of my beautiful daughter, but also because I believe that along the way I came across other families that I feel didn't have a voice. Little people who didn't have a voice, who you will never see in these sorts of environments. And I kind of started to feel that I needed to be strong to try and speak out if I could.
Is it more difficult, do you think, for people that don't fit the profile of white middle-class male?
Well, I think that's a really important question because, you know, I come from a social work background. And in social work, I don't feel there's a particular stigma in talking about diversity, equality, you know, people with different backgrounds who may face discrimination because they have a disability, racial discrimination. So that was my background. I was used to talking about those things. And I felt those things were present in my case. There were the children with Down syndrome, and there were these issues about not being given information and treatment. There were the working class families in my group. I felt that there was kind of a pattern that has still not been explained about why we were not offered information and treatment. And I feel that that possibly throws up issues about whether we were seen as of less value. And I think it's been difficult to tell that story as a black woman. I've tried to talk about my experiences as a person from a minority ethnic background, and I feel that talking in that way doesn't fit the mould. You know, that patient safety is constructed in a particular way, but some of us may have not had a good experience because of discrimination. Maybe we were not treated the same, and also in trying to have that voice with patient and public representation, those representatives are often invariably white middle class, and there has been, you know, report after report after report that talks about getting more diversity in terms of representation, and that hasn't necessarily happened. I go to meeting after meeting where people talk about hard to reach groups, but to me that concept doesn't make sense. We're in London with high numbers of people from minority ethnic backgrounds, so we can't talk about people that are hard to reach.
Do you feel that people are treating you with more respect now?
I definitely feel there's been a shift since post-Francis, without a doubt, that I don't feel I could have been in this room in the past. I don't feel I could have told my story on this platform, in this room. In fact, I did come to a couple of these lectures and I would sit at the back. And for people who know me, they would know that I would be desperate to ask a question. My questions were probably going to be about patient involvement or about accountability. And I'd sit there at the back shaking because I thought, someone at the front's going to know me and they're going to ignore my question, or they're going to look at me in that steel, cold way, which means your question is not important. And, you know, post-Francis, I'm allowed to do those things. I am allowed to ask those questions. I am in the room. I'm co-chairing with Mike on the National Patient Safety Steering Committee, and I feel as a harmed patient, and I have been prepared to say that's what I am. That's what I come with. I'm not going to change it. And I feel that, you know, harmed patients haven't often been treated with that respect, haven't been valued. But I feel that as a harmed patient being involved on the steering committee, I am being treated differently, but the issues to do with my daughter are completely unresolved. And I don't feel that I can be treated with respect until those issues are addressed.
Thank you, Josephine.
Would you mind if I just finished with bringing my other
yes.
daughter?
Yeah.
I want to bring my other daughter into the room because, so this is, so the picture, so Kelly is at the back, the other twin. This picture was taken shortly before Krista died. She's in the front, and they were both 17 years old there. The reason I want to share my daughter Kelly's poem is because this long campaign that I have fought has had a massive impact upon her. And she wants me to get justice because she knows that I won't find any peace until I do get those answers. But it impacts negatively on her life for me to keep campaigning and for me to be so sad. And so a couple of years ago, she wrote this poem, and I just read it because I'm trying to bring her into the room. So, a poem for Krista by Kelly Ocloo. Chris, it's been nearly 17 years, and still we have to face the fears that justice may not be served when the truth and evidence prove it's absolutely deserved. So much has happened, but somehow still seems unchanged. You're still so close to me, I still think about you constantly. When I do, it makes me smile. So many happy memories, while I cry that you have been taken from us. Oh, Krista, it really has been tough. But something wonderful has come despite our size. I am a mother, I have a son who has put the joy back in Mum's eyes. You would love him, he's just so clever, and he's only 2. I just want you to know that we will never stop loving and remembering you. You will stay in our hearts forever and more. Double our age now at nearly 34. Thank you.
Thank you.
After that poem, thank you so much for sharing your incredibly difficult and personal journey with us, and thank you, Jill, for acting as interviewee there. Are you happy to take a question or two if anybody has questions for you? Does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments that they'd like to make following this? Have we got the other microphone somewhere? If we could just have it down the front here. If you don't mind just waiting for the microphone, if that's okay.
During all this process, up to the point where you first went to court, had the Royal Brompton said to you, we've conducted an inquiry, we've found that there was negligence, we're extremely sorry, one clinician has been referred to the GMC, would you have taken it further?
No, I never wanted to go into court. If they had done those things, I wouldn't have gone into court because no, I can't, I've never, there's been a lot of myths. All these myths about people go to court or they're malicious or they've got a thing against the medical profession. For most people, it's simply not true. Why on earth would you put yourself through something like a court experience where, if you lose, you could kind of lose your house? If they'd been open and honest. And I have shared platforms. I shared one amazing platform with a doctor who talked about the impact upon the family when he did exactly like what you just said. And it completely changed things, and in fact, they ended up being quite close. And I just believe if that had happened to me, my life would have been so different. And it didn't happen, it still hasn't happened. And yet it's quite clear to me that there are unresolved issues, that all of those 3 inquiries, the very 3 inquiries I went through under the Brompton, cleared the hospital, and yet after and outside of those inquiries, it was obvious that there were major problems. And the fact there are all these other cases and evidence has been withheld from those inquiries, somebody needs to do the right thing.
And how many cases do you know of similar to your daughter's since her death?
About 22, and the same consultant, similar patterns of withholding information and treatment.
So 22 deaths and
not
probably,
all deaths, a lot of deaths.
And hundreds of thousands of public money has been wasted because they didn't investigate in the first place.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for raising those good points about open disclosure and honesty and transparency. We've probably got time for one more question, if we could have a fairly quick question. Thank you.
Hello. This is not a question, but more of a comment. That despite the story that Josephine has shared with us, I'm working with Imperial College Health Partners, and we're an organization of partnership organizations with all the Northwest London hospitals and the CCG. And Josephine has just joined our team. She's leading on the Patient Safety Champion Network. And the goal of that is to ensure that all Northwest London GPs, hospitals, CCJs adhere to strict patient safety rules. So we think we've got a huge ambition in our hands. The next few years, we're hopeful that we'll be able to achieve that ambition. And Josephine is really passionate to ensure that patient safety is #1 priority for these organizations rather than any form of financial benefits or financial constraints.
Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Ronki. Okay, I think in the interest of moving on with time, we'll need to draw to a close there, but can I just thank you, Josephine, and also Jill for interviewing you, but thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.